I'm Ava Thompson. I'm 30 years old, and I've spent the last 18 months pouring my heart into building something I thought mattered. I remember standing in that conference room watching Monica Blake's fingers move across her keyboard like none of it meant anything. With just a few clicks, she erased all the partnerships, all the trust, all the nights I stayed up talking with suppliers across the world who counted on us. I watched her lean back in her chair like she had done something brilliant. She didn't even look at me. She just said, "We don't need your international vendor connections anymore." Her voice was sharp and flat, as if she was clearing out old files on her desktop. That sentence landed in me like a brick. I stood there silent, feeling the weight of it settle in my chest. I couldn't find my breath at first, because it wasn't just the projects she deleted. It was my work, my people, my name, my promise to them. Monica kept talking, but the words blurred. I heard phrases float by: emotional baggage, unreliable foreign partners, too much hand-holding. She laughed when she said it, as if she was doing me a favor by cutting them loose. In that moment, I wasn't 30 years old. I was 17 again, standing in our small kitchen staring at my dad's slumped shoulders. He sat at the table, his head resting on a pile of rejection letters, his hands still clutching the final notice from his company. His chest didn't rise or fall anymore. I remember that morning like it never ended. My father believed in people. He believed in loyalty and building partnerships that lasted and treating suppliers like they mattered. He worked in international logistics, and he was good. He spent years creating cross-border deals that helped small factories survive and grow. But the corporate machine didn't care about that. His company brought in someone new, someone who thought emotions were liabilities, and that relationships were just soft spots waiting to be cut. They pushed him out slowly, stripping his work from him, making him rewrite the same reports over and over. They questioned his judgment in public meetings and passed his clients to younger people who didn't know their names. He withered under the weight of being ignored. And now, standing across from Monica, I felt the same slow suffocation. She wasn't just deleting files. She was repeating history. She was the same kind of person who crushed my dad. But I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I stood there and let her finish. Sometimes there's no use fighting the surface battle. Sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should be watching. As I listened, I realized Monica didn't see me. She saw a name on her org chart, a junior manager who should be grateful for the exposure. She didn't know what I'd built behind those spreadsheets. She didn't know about the midnight calls with suppliers in Vietnam, the way I helped a family-run shop in Bulgaria adjust their process to meet our specs, the way I convinced Miguel in Mexico to take a chance on us after he had been burned before. She didn't see any of it because she didn't think it mattered. To her, these people were complications. She didn't know that they were the ones holding her supply chain together. She didn't know that trust isn't a line item in a budget. I kept my face calm. I nodded at the right moments. I made a few notes even though there was nothing left to save. Monica tapped the final key and smiled like she had solved a hard puzzle. She called it operational efficiency. She called it cleaning up emotional clutter. I just called it familiar. My chest tightened as I left the room. My legs carried me down the hall, but my mind stayed in that kitchen with my dad, remembering how small he looked in that chair. I had promised myself back then that I would understand people like her. I would learn their language, their systems, their blind spots. As I stepped into the elevator, my pulse slowed. I had done exactly that. I knew what I was doing. I had spent 18 months building more than contracts. I had built a network that could breathe without Monica. I had built trust she didn't know existed. Sometimes the people you think you can erase are the ones who made the whole thing stand in the first place. Sometimes the people you consider disposable are the ones holding everything together. And sometimes when you think you've won, you've actually just set the pieces in motion for someone else's plan. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when I was a kid, watching my dad shuffle papers that never seemed to bring good news. His name was Daniel Carter. He worked in supply chain management, but to me, he was the man who made things happen around the world. He could explain how fabric moved from a small shop in India to a warehouse in New Jersey, and his eyes would light up when he talked about the people behind the shipments. He believed in partnerships and doing business with a handshake and a promise. He believed that trust could be stronger than a contract. For years, his company trusted him too, until they didn't. Monica Blake joined his company when I was around 13. I didn't know her name back then, but I remember the change in my dad. She didn't attack him directly. She chipped away at him in small, sharp ways. At first, she questioned his reports and meetings, always with a smile, always as if she was just asking for clarification. Then she reassigned his long-standing clients to younger managers. She told the team it was part of a restructuring plan. My dad would come home later looking smaller each time, like the weight of his job was pressing him into the ground. He stopped talking about work at dinner. He stopped calling his old contacts. He spent more time in his home office rewriting reports that used to take him a few hours, but now took days because Monica would send them back with vague feedback that changed every time. It wasn't enough. She spread quiet doubts about his ability to keep up. She hinted that maybe he wasn't as sharp as he used to be. The people he trained started avoiding him. His phone stopped ringing. I remember hearing him breathe hard in the driveway, sitting in his car for a long time before coming inside. He would stare out the window like he was somewhere else. And then one morning I found him at the kitchen table slumped over a pile of documents. His chest was still. His face was peaceful, but everything else in me broke. It wasn't until later that I learned her name. I heard my mother whisper it over the phone, saying Monica Blake like it explained everything. I remember the silence that followed. My dad had survived building a life from nothing, but he couldn't survive someone like her. That day, something settled deep in me. I didn't cry the way people expected. I didn't scream. I just made a quiet promise to myself. I would find people like Monica. I would study them, understand them, and one day I would stand in a room where they would have to look me in the eye. I chose my path carefully. I went to a state university because it was affordable. I majored in business with a focus on international logistics. I wasn't drawn to the spreadsheets or the shipping routes. I was drawn to the power that moved through those systems. I wanted to know where the leverage lived, where people like my dad lost control. I didn't chase grades for recognition. I chased knowledge that could help me dismantle people like her. I took internships with small firms where I could get my hands dirty. I learned how to negotiate contracts, how to build supply chains from scratch, how to read the fine print that most people skipped. I kept my father close with me the whole time. I remembered his kindness, his patience, his belief that people were not just names on an invoice. I wanted to keep that part of him alive in me even as I trained myself to be sharper, harder, more careful. When I graduated, I didn't rush into big companies. I spent years working with mid-sized firms, learning how they connected to global suppliers. I didn't just want to work in logistics. I wanted to know how decisions traveled, how people like Monica thought, where they overlooked the people who made everything possible. I built a career that made me useful to them. I became someone they would want to hire, someone who could bridge complicated supplier relationships and deliver cost savings. I knew if I waited long enough, I would find her again. When the opening at Westbridge Corporation appeared and I saw Monica Blake's name listed as Vice President of Operations, I knew this was the door. I didn't hesitate. I applied knowing I could walk through it. I didn't come to Westbridge for the salary. I didn't come for the promotion. I came because I knew this was where my quiet promise would unfold. I knew I had to face her, not to destroy her, but to make her see what she had ignored for years. I carried my father's memory with me every day in that building. I remembered his voice explaining how supply chains work, how trust travels faster than cargo, how relationships build more than just profit. I knew that somewhere inside the maze of numbers and contracts, there was still space for people who cared. I didn't need to be loud. I didn't need to shout my intentions. I just needed to move carefully to build something she wouldn't see until it was too late. I didn't want to repeat her cruelty. I wanted to create something better, and I was ready. I spent 18 months building the kind of relationships Monica Blake would never understand. I wasn't just looking for suppliers. I was looking for people who had stories like my father's. I found them in small factories tucked behind city streets, in workshops run by families who had lost everything once and rebuilt from the ground up. I found them in Vietnam, in Bulgaria, in Mexico. Each of them had been burned before by American companies who promised long-term contracts and disappeared the moment a cheaper option appeared. They knew the cost of trusting the wrong people. They were careful now, guarded, but they still hoped to find one company that would see them as more than numbers on a spreadsheet. I showed up with patience. I asked about their stories, about the businesses their parents had started, about the sacrifices their families made to keep those doors open. I didn't promise them forever. I promised them honesty. I promised them that I would protect our partnership as much as I could. When I presented contracts, I made sure the language sounded like routine international protections. Clauses about early termination notice, about shared risk, about withdrawal rights if too many partners were eliminated. I buried them in the middle of standard paperwork. They weren't tricks. They were shields. Each clause was designed to let these suppliers walk away without penalty if the company started treating them like disposable parts. I explained the terms carefully to each supplier, making sure they understood their power. Monica Blake signed every contract without reading the fine print. She cared about the bottom line, about shaving costs, about moving quickly. I presented the agreements as smart savings, international efficiencies, seamless onboarding. I handed her reports with neatly summarized risks, carefully avoiding the parts she would never take the time to question. She smiled when I brought her vendors who offered aggressive pricing. She congratulated me when I delivered contracts that reduced lead times. She told me I was finally thinking like a real operations manager. She never realized that each contract was a thread, and I was weaving them into a net she wouldn't see until she stepped into it. The suppliers trusted me because I didn't hide who I was. I told them my father's story without naming him. I told them how some companies treat people like temporary tools. I told them to protect themselves, to build clauses that would allow them to leave if things went wrong. I worked long hours, but never complained. I traveled across time zones, met with production managers at odd hours, listened when they worried about being abandoned again. I wasn't just building contracts. I was building a network that could move as one if needed. The coordinated withdrawal clause was the heart of it. It was a quiet agreement that if one supplier was cut without proper cause, the others could walk away together. Monica approved it every time. She thought it was harmless. She thought it would never matter. The more I worked, the more Monica relied on me. She handed me more responsibility, more international accounts, more decisions. She never saw me as a threat. She saw me as the diligent middle manager who asked just enough questions to appear curious, but never enough to seem dangerous. I documented everything. I kept records of every signed agreement, every conversation, every time Monica dismissed supplier concerns as emotional complications. I knew I had to be patient. Timing was everything. This wasn't about crushing her in a dramatic moment. It was about creating a system that would speak for itself when the time came. There were days I wanted to move faster, days I wanted to confront her directly, but I knew that wouldn't work. People like Monica don't hear anger. They only notice what they can't control. So I kept working. I kept building. I strengthened the network until every critical component in our supply chain depended on these international partnerships. I made sure no domestic supplier could match their pricing or quality. I made sure we were deeply connected. I watched Monica brush off their contributions as complicated and inefficient. I watched her label them as foreign liabilities. She never noticed the weight of what I had built. I didn't need to trap her. I just needed to be ready for when she would inevitably make the same mistake she had made years ago with my father. I knew she would. People like her always do. The safety net was in place. The suppliers knew their rights. The contracts were signed. The system was quietly waiting, and so was I. Monica Blake sat in her office that morning, flipping through supplier reports like they were scrap paper. She barely looked up when she told me the decision was final. We are moving all production to domestic sources. No more international contracts. It's too much hand-holding, too many cultural complications. I reminded her carefully about the termination clauses. I told her these suppliers were critical. She waved me off like I was slowing her down. She clicked through the termination screens one by one. She didn't hesitate. I watched her delete the contracts. I didn't stop her. I didn't argue. I let her finish, let her feel in control, let her believe she had won. When she dismissed me, I walked out of her office calmly. My hands didn't shake. My heart stayed steady. I stepped into the hallway and took a quiet breath. The time had come. I didn't go back to my desk. I headed straight to the stairwell where I could speak without anyone listening. I called the first number on my list. It was almost midnight in Vietnam, but he picked up on the second ring. I gave him one sentence. It's time. He understood. I made the next call to Bulgaria, the next to Mexico. Each one knew what to do. The network was already in place. The suppliers would contact each other directly. Each phone call would trigger 3 more. Within hours, the word had spread across 12 countries. By the next morning, every single international supplier connected to our operations had activated their coordinated withdrawal clauses. They didn't just stop shipments. They severed all commitments immediately. At first, the company didn't notice. The domestic teams kept running as if nothing had changed. But by mid-morning, a production manager called operations in a panic. Critical components hadn't arrived. His line was about to stall. Monica brushed it off as a delay. She said it was probably a customs issue. She told them to push through. But the calls kept coming. Orders weren't just late. They had been canceled. The suppliers were gone. By noon, the aerospace division's production lines were silent. They didn't have the precision parts they needed. The automotive sector shut down shortly after. Packaging materials that could only be sourced from Bulgaria had stopped moving. Supervisors scrambled through the hallways, shouting into phones, demanding updates. Operations managers gathered in emergency rooms, staring at whiteboards filled with gaps they couldn't fill. Monica ordered domestic suppliers to cover the shortages. They quoted double the prices and lead times that stretched into months. I watched quietly from my desk as the panic spread like a fire no one could contain. Monica stormed through the office, barking instructions, calling legal, asking why the contracts allowed such fast termination. No one had an answer she wanted to hear. She told the executive team it was a temporary disruption. She insisted we could pivot quickly. She blamed unreliable foreign vendors. She blamed outdated systems. But her voice didn't sound as sharp now. It trembled under the pressure. By the next morning, our largest client, a defense contractor, called the CEO directly. They wanted to know why production had halted. They wanted guarantees we couldn't give. Monica tried to stall. She tried to find quick fixes. But there were no substitutes. These were not just suppliers. These were specialized partners who had built their operations around our specifications. Monica finally realized she didn't know how deep the problem ran. She didn't know how tightly our supply chain had wrapped itself around the people she had just erased. I stayed silent. I answered questions when asked. I provided the documents Monica needed to see. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The system I had built was working exactly as I intended. It wasn't about revenge in the loud way people imagine. It was about precision. It was about understanding how to build something that could collapse the moment it was treated like it didn't matter. Monica spent the next 2 days in closed-door meetings trying to repair the damage. She asked the remaining suppliers to come back. They refused. She begged domestic vendors to fill orders. They couldn't. The factory floors stayed silent. Orders piled up. Clients threatened to walk. People whispered in the hallways, wondering how this had happened so fast. They looked at me, sometimes trying to read my face, but I gave them nothing. Monica tried to present new plans, but the urgency had already slipped out of her control. She didn't know how to hold this together. She had never known. She thought power was about making decisions quickly, about cutting what seemed weak. She never understood that what she thought was weak had been the only thing keeping the system alive. The collapse didn't come with alarms or headlines. It came in quiet phone calls and stopped shipments. It came in canceled orders and contracts that slipped through her fingers. It came exactly the way I had planned. CEO Ethan Ross called me into his office the next morning. His voice over the phone was steady but sharp. He didn't waste time. He wanted me in the executive meeting immediately. I walked into the room where Monica Blake already sat, surrounded by senior managers who looked exhausted. The air was heavy. Ethan asked me to explain what had happened. Monica had her explanation ready. She called it a miscalculation, a supplier overreaction, a brief disruption. Ethan let her finish before turning to me. He asked me what I saw. I opened my laptop and quietly laid out the documents I had been building for months. I showed him the contracts Monica had signed, the withdrawal clauses she had skipped over, the risk summaries she had ignored. I showed him the map of our global supplier network, how every critical component now flowed through the partners she had just erased. He asked why no one had flagged this sooner. I explained that I had provided the summaries, but Monica chose not to review the full terms. She trusted that the suppliers would stay loyal no matter how they were treated. She thought they needed us more than we needed them. Ethan's expression tightened as I walked him through the financial impact. I showed him the pricing structures, the quality benchmarks, the supplier commitments. These weren't just vendors. They had built their businesses around us. They had invested in new equipment, hired additional staff, expanded their capacity based on our partnership. I presented the letters I received over the last 2 days. Each supplier confirmed they would only consider returning if Monica Blake had no further involvement in international supply chain management. They said it plainly. Trust could not be rebuilt with her in place. Ethan read those letters carefully. He looked at Monica, then back at me. He asked if I believed we could restore the partnerships. I said yes, but not quickly and not without real changes. I told him the suppliers were not angry. They were cautious. They had been burned before. This was not about punishment. It was about self-protection. Ethan sat in silence for a long moment. He tapped his pen against the table, processing the damage. Finally, he turned to Monica and asked why she had not reviewed the termination clauses. She said she trusted the summaries I had provided. He asked why she had not consulted operations before cutting nearly 70% of our supply chain. She said she thought it was a simple shift to domestic partners. Ethan's voice was calm, but his words were sharp. He asked how Monica had missed that nearly all the contracts were linked. She had no answer that satisfied anyone in that room. He closed his folder and looked at me directly. He asked if I would be willing to take over as director of global supply chain. I nodded and said I would accept. He told Monica she would transition to a new role focusing on domestic customer support effective immediately. Monica's face barely moved, but I could see the shock in her eyes. She tried to argue, but Ethan cut her off. The decision was final. The room emptied quickly after that. Monica caught up to me near the elevators. She asked what I had told the suppliers about her. I told her I had only shared her words, her decisions, her attitude. I told her the suppliers knew exactly how she saw them. They didn't need me to explain it. She said they had overreacted. I said they had simply protected themselves. She asked if I planned this from the beginning. I said I built relationships. The rest unfolded on its own. I left her standing there not out of spite, but because there was nothing else to say. She had made the decisions. She had triggered the collapse. I had only made sure that the people holding the weight had the option to walk away when they no longer felt valued. The next day I moved into my new office. It wasn't about the title. It wasn't about the corner view. It was about knowing I had kept my promise to myself. I had stayed quiet. I had been patient. And I had rebuilt a system where trust was stronger than control. 8 months later, Monica Blake emailed me. The message was short. She asked if I would be willing to meet her for coffee. I sat with the request for a few days, unsure of what I wanted to feel. I had not thought much about her since the day I took over. The company had settled into a new rhythm. The suppliers had returned. Trust was slowly rebuilding. Part of me wondered why she wanted to meet. I expected maybe she wanted to defend herself, or ask me how I had planned it all. I expected some unfinished fight. But when I walked into the small cafe on the east side, I found her sitting alone at a corner table. She looked different. Not just tired, smaller, softer. She looked like someone who had been standing in the middle of her own storm and finally stopped trying to hold everything up by herself. She stood when she saw me and offered a quiet hello. I sat across from her. The table between us felt wide at first. She thanked me for agreeing to meet. Her voice didn't carry its usual sharpness. She didn't start with excuses. She didn't ask about the company. She asked how I was. I told her I was doing well. I told her the supply chain had stabilized, the international partnerships were stronger than before, and the company had earned back the trust it had lost. She nodded slowly, as if she already knew. She said she had been working in customer support, hearing the voices of frustrated people all day. People who felt ignored by systems that didn't see them. She said she finally understood what it felt like to be on the other side of the decisions she used to make so quickly. She said she used to believe that efficiency meant eliminating anything that made business feel complicated. She used to believe that people's stories were noise, that emotions were distractions, that moving fast was always the right move. She told me that for years she thought she was being strong by cutting ties without hesitation. Her eyes stayed on the coffee cup in front of her. She said she realized now that she had been wrong. She had spent years trying to control everything, thinking that the less she cared, the better she would lead. She told me she had been chasing the wrong things. She said the collapse of the supply chain was not the hardest part. The hardest part was realizing that no one wanted to rebuild with her. The hardest part was seeing that trust is not something you can demand back once it is gone. I listened quietly. I didn't need to add anything. She was not asking me to tell her it was all okay. She was not looking for permission to feel better. She was simply laying it down. She said she knew now that the strongest people are not the ones who cut the fastest. The strongest people are the ones who build things that last. The ones who are willing to hold space for complexity. The ones who choose to care even when it slows them down. She looked at me and asked me one question. Did you plan it from the beginning? I told her the truth. I planned to protect the people I trusted. I planned to give them a way out if they were ever treated like they didn't matter. I didn't plan for her to fall. That part she did on her own. She smiled a tired, quiet smile. She said that was fair. She said she used to think the people who cared were soft. She never thought they would be the ones who held all the weight. I could have told her how long I had waited for that moment. I could have told her how I had spent years thinking about what I would say to her if we ever sat like this. But sitting there across from someone who was no longer trying to win, I realized I didn't need to say any of it. Sometimes the real victory is not in watching someone break. It's in knowing they finally see what they refused to see before. It's in knowing that something shifted even if no one else will ever know. She thanked me for meeting her. I told her I was glad she reached out. We sat a little longer, letting the silence settle. When we finally stood, there was no grand apology, no request for forgiveness. But there was something honest in her voice when she said goodbye. I walked away from that cafe without feeling the weight I thought I would carry. I didn't feel like I had won a battle. I didn't feel like I had lost anything either. I felt like something had finished. And it finished in the right way. I used to think revenge would feel sharper, louder, more satisfying. I thought I would need to see someone fall to feel peace. But it turned out the strongest revenge was no revenge at all. It was patience. It was building something better. It was standing in the middle of the story and realizing I didn't need to destroy her. I just needed to be the person she never saw coming, and that was enough.